They said no one could save him, not even the best doctors in the world. The billionaire's baby was dying and time was running out. But then, something unthinkable happened. A poor black man, a single father with no connections, walked into the hospital with nothing but his courage, and the impossible became reality. How did he pull off what 18 doctors couldn't? What could have driven him to do the unthinkable? This is a story of love, desperation, and a truth we don't want to face. Stay with me, because the real question here is who's really saving who. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming twists and turns in this gripping tale. Let's get started.
Tyrone had always been a fighter, but not in the way most people think. As a single dad, his world revolved around his little girl, Jasmine. He worked 2 jobs, one as a mechanic during the day and another late into the night at a convenience store. Life wasn't easy, but it was simple. There was a rhythm to it: wake up, work, care for Jasmine, repeat. He found joy in the small moments, teaching her to ride a bike, laughing over dinner, or reading her favorite bedtime stories. But nothing had prepared him for this. It started like any other day. He was driving home from his night shift, the car's headlights casting long shadows on the empty road. His thoughts were still on work, on bills, and on what he'd need to get done in the morning. Then the call came. The voice on the other end, urgent, frantic, told him something he couldn't believe. His daughter, Jasmine, was in the hospital. She'd been rushed in for an emergency procedure, and the doctors said it was critical. Tyrone's heart dropped. He knew nothing could prepare him for what was coming, but he was determined to find out. Little did he know, this would set in motion a chain of events that would put him face to face with a world he never imagined he'd be part of, a world of privilege, power, and racial tension, where his very existence was questioned. Tyrone had always carried the weight of being black in America. He wasn't naive. He knew how people viewed him, how they treated him. The looks, the assumptions, the automatic judgments that followed him wherever he went. He had become accustomed to being seen as less than, less capable, less important, but none of that mattered now, not when his daughter's life was on the line. He gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped down the darkened streets, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, the crushing reality of the situation settling in. The hospital was still a few miles away, but already his mind was racing through 1,000 different scenarios. What if it was too late? What if he couldn't make it in time? What if the doctors couldn't save her? As Tyrone pulled into the hospital parking lot, he didn't know what to expect. He'd been here before, of course, but never under circumstances like this. The fluorescent lights above the entrance were too bright, almost blinding. The sterile, clinical atmosphere hit him immediately, and the smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, a constant reminder of where he was. Tyrone rushed through the doors, his pulse racing as he approached the front desk. The receptionist barely looked up as she greeted him, her smile cold and mechanical. He could tell immediately that she wasn't interested in his presence, let alone his urgency. "I need to see my daughter. Her name is Jasmine Walker," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. The receptionist glanced at her screen, typing lazily. She didn't seem to notice the desperation in his voice. "Please wait," she said flatly, her eyes not leaving the screen. Tyrone clenched his fists, fighting the urge to shout at her, but he knew it wouldn't help. He wasn't here for a fight. He was here for his daughter, so he nodded curtly and took a seat in the waiting area. The room was filled with people, some talking softly, others staring blankly at their phones. No one seemed to notice the weight of Tyrone's presence, the urgency that was consuming him. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. It was all he could do to keep his mind from spiraling. He glanced at the clock. The time was slipping away. His thoughts were racing in every direction, hopelessness and fear wrapping around him like a vice. What was happening to Jasmine? Was she awake? Was she still fighting for her life? Finally, a nurse came out from behind the double doors. She was young, with blonde hair tied back into a neat ponytail, and she had that look, the kind of look that said she'd seen it all. When her eyes met Tyrone's, she didn't seem surprised to see him waiting there. She didn't acknowledge him at first, but after a long moment she said, "You're the father of Jasmine Walker." Tyrone stood up immediately, his body tensed with anticipation. "Yes, what's happening to her? Is she okay?" The nurse hesitated, glancing down at her clipboard. Her eyes briefly flickered over to the other patients in the room before returning to him. "I'm not sure, sir. The doctors are still evaluating her. She's in critical condition. We're doing everything we can, but it's too soon to tell." Tyrone's chest tightened. He felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. "I need to see her." "Please," he implored. The nurse's expression softened slightly. "I understand, but you'll have to wait for the doctor to update you. I'll let them know you're here." Tyrone wanted to argue, to demand answers, but he knew better. He needed to be patient, but every second felt like a small eternity. The fear in his gut gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the image of Jasmine's small, frail body lying on that hospital bed. Just as he was about to sit back down, the doors to the ER opened. A tall doctor in a white coat stepped out, his face unreadable. Tyrone's heart leapt in his chest. The doctor walked directly toward him. "Mr. Walker," the doctor said, his voice calm but distant. He didn't offer a handshake, didn't acknowledge Tyrone as anything more than another patient's family member. Tyrone nodded, his throat tight. "Your daughter's condition is serious," the doctor continued. "She's stable for now, but we're doing all we can." Tyrone's pulse quickened. "What does that mean? What's wrong with her? Why won't anyone tell me anything?" His voice was rising now, filled with frustration and fear. The doctor glanced at the nurse, who was still standing by the door but said nothing. After a long pause, he finally spoke again. "We're running tests, but her condition is critical. We'll need to perform more procedures soon, and we're not sure what the outcome will be. It's going to take time." Time. Tyrone could feel the weight of that word pressing down on him. Every moment felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and every second that passed without answers felt like one step closer to losing his daughter. He had to act. He couldn't wait any longer. But how? What could he do when every door seemed closed, every option limited? Tyrone felt his blood pressure rising as the doctor's words echoed in his head. "We're doing all we can." He wasn't sure if the words were meant to comfort him or just another way to avoid responsibility. Everything inside him screamed that he needed to do something, anything, but there was nothing he could do but wait, and that wait felt like a lifetime. The nurse gestured for Tyrone to follow her as she walked down the narrow hallway toward the intensive care unit. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed like an electric current, a constant hum in his ears. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, the chaos of the hospital just behind the doors. People were talking in hushed tones, some coming and going in hurried steps. But for Tyrone, the world outside of the hospital seemed to stop, consumed by his daughter's life hanging in the balance. When they reached Jasmine's room, Tyrone stood frozen in the doorway for a moment. His eyes fell on her fragile body, hooked up to machines and IVs, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The sight hit him harder than any punch could. His baby girl, the one he had protected, the one he had promised to love and care for no matter what, was lying there in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. Tyrone's throat tightened as he walked to her side, reaching out to hold her small hand, feeling the coldness of her skin. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. He wasn't sure if everything would be okay, or if he'd ever have the chance to tell her again. The nurse stepped aside, giving him a moment alone with his daughter. "We'll be just outside if you need anything," she said softly before closing the door behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Tyrone stayed there for what felt like hours, sitting by Jasmine's side, praying, pleading for her to wake up. Every time the door opened, his heart leaped in his chest, hoping for good news, but it was always the same. Nothing, no answers, no solutions. The hours dragged on with no sign of improvement. After a while, the doctor returned, this time accompanied by a woman in a crisp, expensive suit. Tyrone hadn't seen her before, but there was something about her, something in the way she held herself, the look in her eyes that made him uneasy. She was clearly someone important. "Mr. Walker," the doctor said, addressing him as though his name were a formality. "This is Dr. Sutherland. She's one of our top specialists." Dr. Sutherland extended a hand, but Tyrone didn't take it. He felt his stomach tighten. It wasn't the woman's presence that unsettled him. It was the way the doctor had introduced her, as though her title alone was meant to convince him she had all the answers. "I'm sure you're already aware that your daughter's condition is critical," Dr. Sutherland said, her tone flat, almost robotic. "We've tried all the standard procedures, but she's not responding. We're currently looking at other options." Tyrone felt a pit open in his stomach. "Other options," he repeated, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "You mean you've been doing things to my daughter, and now you're telling me it hasn't worked?" His voice cracked with frustration, and the weight of the helplessness bearing down on him grew heavier by the second. Dr. Sutherland glanced at the doctor beside her, as though seeking confirmation. She continued, her eyes never meeting Tyrone's. "Yes, but as I said, we're looking into alternative treatments. We need to act quickly, but we must also be cautious." Tyrone didn't know what he was expecting, but this wasn't it. Every word felt like a dismissal, like they were speaking around him, not to him. His anger swelled, and it took everything in him to remain composed. The look in Dr. Sutherland's eyes, the coldness of the room, it all added up to something Tyrone had feared his whole life. He was being ignored. His daughter was just another case, another patient among many, and the only thing standing between her life and death was the indifference of a system built on privilege. He stood up abruptly, causing the chair to scrape against the floor. "I'm not going to just sit here and wait while you people figure this out," Tyrone said, his voice rising. "You don't get to just treat my daughter like she's another number in your files. She's my flesh and blood, and I'm not leaving this room until I know you've done everything you can." "You hear me?" Dr. Sutherland remained calm, but the flicker of surprise in her eyes told Tyrone everything he needed to know. She wasn't used to being challenged like this, not by someone like him. Not by a father with no title, no wealth, no power. The doctor beside her stepped forward, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "Mr. Walker, please, we understand your frustration. We want to help. But we can only do so much with the resources we have. There are protocols." "Protocols," Tyrone interrupted, his voice thick with anger. "You've got protocols for saving lives, but what about the lives of people like me? People like my daughter? Do those protocols include ignoring us because we're not rich enough, not important enough?" There was a moment of silence, a breath that seemed to hang in the air. Tyrone's words hung between them like a sharp edge, cutting through the sterile atmosphere. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next, but there was no turning back now. He looked at Dr. Sutherland, her eyes now locked with his. "You think you've tried everything. You haven't even tried listening." The words seemed to echo in the room, and for the first time, Tyrone saw a flicker of something in Dr. Sutherland's eyes. Was it guilt? Or was it just the realization that she couldn't dismiss him as easily as she had intended? The doctor glanced at her again, then back at Tyrone. "I'll have the team look at this again," he said, his tone softer now, almost as if he had been shaken by Tyrone's words. Tyrone didn't know if it would make a difference. He didn't know if this was just another empty promise, a gesture of appeasement, but it was all he had, it was all he could do. And for the first time since he'd arrived at the hospital, he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. The next few hours felt like days. Tyrone's mind raced with thoughts of Jasmine, her fragile body hooked up to machines, struggling to survive. His anger still burned within him, the fury from the earlier confrontation simmering just beneath the surface. But now, as the hospital staff began to finally take him seriously, something else crept in. Doubt, fear. Could they really save her? Would this new doctor, the one who had agreed to recheck her case, be the one to make the difference? Or was it too late? He stood by her side, pacing back and forth, unable to sit still. The room felt suffocating, too small for the whirlwind of emotions inside him. He couldn't stop thinking about the arrogance of Dr. Sutherland, the way she had treated him like an outsider, a nuisance in her pristine world. And yet, the mere fact that they were willing to listen now was something. But was it enough? Was it enough to save his daughter from the system that had overlooked her? Tyrone clenched his fists, looking at Jasmine's small face, pale and peaceful despite the chaos around her. She was his world, and he couldn't stand the thought of losing her. How many times had he worked overtime, barely getting enough sleep, all for this moment, to be there for her, to give her a future? Now it felt like all of that was slipping away, like his efforts meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. Minutes later, the door to the room opened, and Tyrone's heart skipped a beat. It was the young doctor who had taken the time to speak with him earlier, the one who had been different from the others. His face was tense, his brow furrowed as he entered. Without speaking, he moved to Jasmine's bedside, his hands quick and practiced as he examined the various monitors attached to her. Tyrone's eyes never left the doctor. Is she getting better? Is she going to be okay? The doctor didn't immediately answer. He checked the IV drip, adjusted the machines, and scribbled something on his notepad. Tyrone's impatience grew with each passing second. "Doc, tell me something. Please, I need to know." The young doctor finally turned to him, his face somber. "We've been trying every possible method. But it's been a constant battle between her body's ability to heal and the complications that continue to arise. Her condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated." Tyrone's chest tightened, and a lump formed in his throat. "But you're trying, right? You're not just giving up." "We're doing everything we can," the doctor repeated, but this time his tone was different, more reassuring, less clinical. Tyrone could feel the walls closing in on him. He wanted to scream, to shake the doctor, but instead he took a deep breath, steadying himself. His daughter was depending on him. He couldn't lose control now. "Tell me what needs to happen," Tyrone said, his voice low but firm. "I'll do whatever it takes." The doctor hesitated before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a procedure we can try, a long shot, but it requires immediate action. It's risky, and we don't have much time. If we wait any longer, we may lose her." The weight of the words hit Tyrone like a punch to the gut. He had always known that life could be cruel, that things could change in an instant, but hearing it out loud, hearing the finality in the doctor's voice, made it all feel so real. His entire world was hanging by a thread. "Do it," Tyrone said without hesitation. His decision was final. His daughter wasn't going to die in this place, not without him fighting every step of the way. I don't care what it takes. Do it, the doctor nodded, then turned to the nurse, giving her quick instructions. Within moments, they were preparing the room for the procedure. Tyrone stood there, watching as the medical team moved around him with practiced efficiency, but all he could focus on was Jasmine. Her small, fragile body was so still, so helpless. The machines beeped in the background, a constant reminder of the battle taking place inside her. As the procedure began, Tyrone's thoughts went back to everything he had faced in the hospital. The coldness from the staff, the dismissive attitudes, the way they had treated him like he didn't matter. His mind was flooded with memories of growing up in a world that didn't care about people like him. How many times had he been overlooked because of his skin color? How many times had he been judged before even having a chance to prove himself? But this time it was different. He was done letting the system define him. He was done letting the world tell him his worth based on where he came from or the color of his skin. Jasmine needed him now more than ever, and he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let anyone or anything stop him from fighting for her. Tyrone clenched his fists again, standing tall by her bed, willing her to hold on. His daughter had been nothing but a fighter her entire life. She had no idea that this was the most important fight she'd ever face, and he wasn't going to let the world win. He wasn't going to let them decide whether she lived or died. Jasmine's life wasn't some statistic, some number on a file. She was his child, his flesh and blood, and she mattered. The machines around him beeped in steady rhythm, a mechanical reminder of the fight taking place in her fragile body, but Tyrone's fight was just beginning. He wasn't sure how much longer the procedure would take, but it felt like an eternity. Every moment felt stretched out, every second passing like a weight on his chest. The room felt colder as his mind raced through every possibility. What if the procedure didn't work? What if this was all for nothing? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the doctor returned. He looked at Tyrone, his face unreadable. For a moment, the air seemed to stand still. The world held its breath. She's stable for now, the doctor said. The procedure worked. We've bought her some time. Tyrone's heart nearly stopped. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His mind was still processing the words as they settled into his bones. Jasmine was alive. For now, she was okay. But Tyrone knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The relief that flooded his chest was immediate but fleeting. Jasmine's condition had stabilized, but the battle was far from over. He sat by her side, his hand never leaving hers, feeling the coolness of her skin and the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. The hospital was still a cold, indifferent place, but in this moment it felt a little warmer. The beeping of the machines, once a constant reminder of his fear, now felt like a song of hope. It wasn't over yet, though. Tyrone knew that. The procedure had worked for now, but there were still tests to be done, and no guarantees that she wouldn't relapse. But one thing had changed. Jasmine had been given a chance, a real chance, and that, he realized, was all that mattered. As the days passed, Tyrone stayed at her side, refusing to leave. He was exhausted, worn down from days without sleep, but he didn't care. Jasmine needed him. Every time the doctors came in to check on her, Tyrone was there, watching carefully, listening closely, making sure that every step was taken to ensure her recovery. He had learned something in those dark hours at her bedside, something about strength, something about fighting, something about not giving up when the world seemed to have forgotten you. The doctors had been shocked at her progress. Every time they came in to check her vitals, they were amazed. The procedure that had saved her wasn't foolproof, it was risky, and they still didn't know if it would work long-term, but it was working, and that was enough for now. Tyrone didn't think much about the hospital's indifference anymore. He had done what he had to do, what any father would do. He demanded action. He'd fought, not just for his daughter, but for himself. For the rights that people like him were often denied, for the love he had for his daughter that no one could ignore. He'd refused to be invisible. Jasmine eventually woke up, her eyes fluttering open. Tyrone couldn't help but smile through his tears. She looked up at him, her small hand squeezing his. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yeah, baby, I'm here," he said, choking back his emotion. "I'm right here." The doctors were amazed at her recovery, but for Tyrone, it wasn't about the medical praise. It wasn't about the doctors or the hospital anymore. It was about his daughter, alive and strong. It was about the love he had for her, a love so fierce that he would do anything, fight anyone to protect her. It was about the realization that sometimes the fight isn't just about winning. It's about showing up, about demanding that your voice be heard, no matter the odds. As the days went on, Tyrone thought about everything he'd experienced in those hospital halls, the dismissive glances, the arrogance, the indifference. He thought about how, if he had stayed silent, if he had just accepted the doctor's words, Jasmine might not be here today. It wasn't just about saving her life. It was about confronting a system that didn't see people like him, people like her, as worthy of the same care, the same urgency. The world didn't always make sense. It was a place that often punished those who didn't fit into the mold of privilege, wealth, and status. But in this moment, Tyrone realized that it wasn't the world's approval he needed. It wasn't the hospital's approval. It was his daughter's life and his love that gave him the power to keep fighting. Jasmine recovered over the next few weeks, her strength returning, her eyes brighter each day. But Tyrone couldn't forget what had happened. He couldn't forget the way the hospital had treated him, the way they had ignored him until he had forced them to listen. The system hadn't changed, but in that moment Tyrone had made a change, and he wasn't going to stop now. Every time he looked at Jasmine, he saw more than just his daughter. He saw a symbol of resilience. He saw a future where people like her, like him, wouldn't have to fight for their voices to be heard. But for that to happen, the world had to change. Tyrone knew the battle wasn't over, not just for his family, but for everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, and ignored. He had fought for Jasmine's life, and he had won. But the fight for equality, for justice, was far from finished. The question now wasn't just about Jasmine. It was about how many more people would be ignored, how many more lives would be dismissed before the world woke up. How many more children would have to fight for their right to live? How many more fathers would have to beg for their voices to be heard? And how many more systems of injustice would remain in place, only to be disrupted by the strength of a single person's voice? This wasn't just one story. This was the story of millions, and it was a story that needed to be told. So what will you do? Will you stay silent? Or will you stand up like Tyrone did and make the world hear your voice? Every time Tyrone looked at Jasmine, he saw something more than just his daughter. He saw the future he wanted, a world where people like her wouldn't have to fight for justice, where people like him could walk into any room and be seen for who they truly were, not the labels they were assigned. His daughter's survival wasn't just about one man's fight for his family. It was about a much larger, much deeper fight for everyone who had been overlooked and forgotten. Tyrone's victory was a personal one, yes, but it was also a victory for the millions of people who still fought every day to be treated with respect, to be seen for who they truly were, regardless of their race, their background, or their status. As Tyrone walked out of the hospital with Jasmine in his arms, the sunlight broke through the heavy clouds that had settled over him for so long. The weight on his shoulders seemed to lift, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the warmth of a new beginning. Jasmine, now awake and holding tightly to his neck, smiled weakly, her small hand resting on his shoulder. The world outside seemed brighter, fuller, and the light from the sun felt like a promise that no matter how hard the world tried to keep them down, Tyrone would always rise to fight for what mattered most. He walked toward the future, hand in hand with his daughter, knowing the battle wasn't over, but today they had won. And as Tyrone stood outside the hospital, raising his fist in the air, leading a protest demanding equality, justice, and better treatment for all people, he knew the fight was just beginning. This wasn't just about one hospital or one father's story. This was about the countless others who had been pushed aside, ignored, or belittled because of the color of their skin. Tyrone's voice was just one in a sea of voices, but it was loud, it was strong, and it was relentless. He was no longer just a father fighting for his daughter. He was a man fighting for the rights of every person who had ever been silenced. And as Tyrone walked out of the hospital, his daughter in his arms, he felt the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. He had fought and he had won. For now, Jasmine was okay. For now, he had changed something. But the fight was far from over. The journey toward justice had only just begun. And Tyrone knew that if he stood strong, if he kept fighting, he would see a world where equality wasn't just a dream, it was a reality. This wasn't just one story, this was everyone's story, and together they would change the world.